Hello, I'm back again. In this set of video lectures, we'll get into Chapter 2, which talks about the importance of compliance as it relates to a medical office. Okay, again, Chapter 2, covering medical record auditing compliance in the medical office. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which we almost invariably refer to as CMS, publishes regulatory information in the Federal Register. This is the basis for what is reimbursed, how it's reimbursed, and when for both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare, of course, being the insurance program sponsored by the federal government for the elderly and disabled. Medicaid, of course, being for people without health insurance. Many third-party payers eventually adopt either all or a portion of CMS's rules and regulations. So basically, as one colleague said to me, CMS sets the tone for everything else. And again, if going back to what we talked about in coding, if it's not documented, it never happened, therefore you can't bill for it. There has traditionally been a lot more oversight on hospital medical records, but now with the medical office, we're seeing increasing scrutiny on medical office visits. So very important to document all services that are being given to the patient and everything being supported. And again, most medical offices now, of course, are electronic. There's still some paper records out there. HIPAA privacy and confidentiality, very important. I'll let you read these things. Again, there's so much material here in this chapter. I think it's probably best that people read it as opposed to me just going through every slide by slide. Now, again, with compliance, now with CMS, we actually have monetary penalties, civil monetary penalties, commonly referred to as CMP. And this can be ranging to the tens of thousands of dollars to 3 times the amount claimed. So if you're a large organization like Kaiser Permanente, this could be in the millions or billions of dollars. This also makes jail time possible, especially if somebody is engaging in deliberate false claims in order to get government funds as a violation of the False Claims Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And again, with this new focus, now we have a lot of emphasis where we talk about fraud and abuse laws. These are things like the Federal False Claims Act, which is a law that dates back to the administration of Abraham Lincoln, civil monetary penalties law, anti-kickback laws, physician self-referral, known as the Stark statute, exclusion statutes, DOJ, OIG, oh my God, DHS, HHS. What does all this stuff mean? Well, let's take a look, first of all, at what exactly is fraud and abuse. You see people using these terms interchangeably. They're actually similar but distinctly different. Fraud is basically the intentional, note in emphasis on intentional deception or misrepresentation. So in other words, somebody's upcoding, they know that this is false, they're submitting the claim anyway. It's a deliberate falsehood. And the people that do these deliberate falsehoods could be a beneficiary, could be a provider, could be a medical office manager who's creating fake patients to get reimbursement for care that never happened. It could be a business entity. Several of them you've probably heard about in the news, HCA, Humana, and others. So that's what fraud is. Think of fraud as that deliberate deception. And again, some of these things, billing for things that weren't provided, altering claims forms, applying for duplicate reimbursement, soliciting, getting kickbacks, all these different things are fraud. Abuse is a little bit different. Abuse is when a healthcare entity doesn't follow proper coding and billing, and it's not deliberate, right? It's still the same type of issue where somebody's not following proper coding and billing practices, but it's lacking the intent, if you will. And again, some of these things that are abuse. Think of abuse as kind of negligence, submitting excessive charges, submitting claims or services that weren't really needed, right? They're not medically necessary. So somebody comes in a medical office for a self-limiting problem, but will order all these tests anyway, right? That's abuse. Breaching assigned agreements, exceeding the limiting charges. All these things are examples of abuse. Again, difference between fraud and abuse. Fraud, deliberate deception. This is more gross negligence. They should have known, but they just screwed up. And again, some examples of this: billing Medicare at a higher or different fee schedule, improper billing practices, violating Medicare participation agreements, submitting claims that involve collusion between a provider and a beneficiary, making place of service errors, using outpatient physical therapy services more often than is allowed. All these things are examples of abuse. Your text also talks about the False Claims Act, and this is any person who knowingly makes or causes a false record to get a false or fraudulent claim paid by the government, and it's technically illegal. And again, to be guilty under the False Claims Act, as you'll see in a case study that I have planned for you, you don't need to have an intent to defraud. Just knowingly includes not only the actual knowledge, but acting in deliberate ignorance or even reckless disregard. So that's essentially what the False Claims Act is saying, is we really don't care that you did it intentionally or not. It's still guilty under the False Claims Act. And again, anti-kickback statute basically is prohibiting any inducement for a physician referral to generate business involving an item covered under Medicare or Medicaid. This could be, we always think of it as money, but it's also travel, meals, all these different types of things. People being brought on for a consulting arrangement for a medical device, all these things are covered under anti-kickback. And any practitioner or others who pay or receive these may face a penalty of upwards to $50,000 plus 3 times the amount of remuneration. And in addition, may also include fines, jail, and exclusion from federal healthcare programs such as Medicare and Medicaid. And this has actually happened in some cases. Your text also talks about the safe harbor regulation that describes various payment practices that potentially implicate anti-kickback statutes, but are not treated as offenses. And in order to be protected from this, the safe harbor, as the lawyers like to say, must exist. So in other words, you need to have access to healthcare, quality of healthcare, patient freedom. In other words, the patient chose to go to that provider, all these other different types of things. So these are some carve outs from the anti-kickback statute. And related to anti-kickback, we also have the Stark Law. And again, this is basically the physician self-referral law. So what this does is limit physician referrals to entity that the same physician has a financial ownership. And then we always think of ownership as actually owning it, but it could be owned by a family member. There was a case in Southern California where people were referring, a primary care office was referring to a specialist that was the daughter of said primary care practice physician, right? So all those things are covered under the Stark Law. Well, what kind of health services are included under the Stark Law? Well, it includes both inpatient and outpatient hospital services, PT, OT, pathology, which is one that is under constant scrutiny, home health, radiology, radiation therapy, prosthetics, orthotics, pharmacy services, and many others. And again, these penalties for violating the Stark Act include fines or exclusion from, when we see participation in federal healthcare programs, that's Medicare and Medicaid. And for many medical practices, this can be upwards to 3/4 of your revenue. So that is a big concern. Related to that, we have the exclusion statute, and the Office of the Inspector General, or as we commonly refer to it as the OIG, is required to exclude individuals and entities from participating in federal healthcare programs, meaning Medicare and Medicaid, for issues of not only fraud and abuse, but patient abuse, neglect, poor quality care, theft, financial misconduct, or one that's been in the news a lot, unlawfully distributing, prescribing, or dispensing controlled substances. And that's all I have for you. Come back for the next video lecture. We'll talk more about specific types of audits that are designed to combat fraud and abuse.